This move, 1. d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, and preparing for a solid pawn structure while controlling key central squares. This move develops a minor piece towards the center and prepares for potential pawn pushes like e6 or g6, often leading to openings like the Indian defenses, aiming for flexible pawn structures. Developing the knight to f3 is a common and flexible move, preparing to castle kingside and supporting a potential c4 pawn push to fight for central space. This move transitions the game towards a more classical pawn structure, preparing to develop the king's bishop and potentially support a central pawn advance like d5. This move signals an intent to fianchetto the king's bishop, aiming for a flexible setup often seen in variations of the king's Indian defense or Catalan opening, preparing to control the long diagonal. This move aggressively challenges white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to gain space and disrupt white's development by potentially creating an isolated pawn or opening lines for black's pieces. The fianchetto of the bishop to g2 prepares to control the long diagonal and supports a potential queenside pawn advance or central maneuvering. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the center and potentially support a kingside attack or counterplay on the queenside. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, attacking black's knight and potentially creating a pin if black doesn't address the threat immediately. This move challenges white's pawn center and aims to open lines for black's pieces, potentially leading to a Queen's Indian or a Nimzo Indian type structure depending on white's response. This move prepares to support the d4 pawn, solidify the center, and potentially develop the queenside pawns while restricting black's queenside expansion. This capture clarifies the pawn structure in the center, opening lines for piece activity and preparing to challenge white's central control while black aims for queenside expansion. This move resolves the tension on the f6 knight, opening lines for your queen and potentially creating a pawn majority on the queenside for black. Black recaptures with the g-pawn, creating doubled pawns but opening the g-file for potential counterplay and preserving pawn mass in the center. White recaptures with the c-pawn, strengthening the center and opening the c-file for potential future queen activity while accepting a slightly compromised pawn structure on the kingside. This move challenges white's central pawn and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and potentially create weaknesses in their pawn structure. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares for potential rook activation on the central files, a standard maneuver in many dynamic opening structures. This move develops the knight to a central square and prepares to challenge white's strong pawn on d4, aiming to improve black's pawn structure. This move prepares to bring the queen into the game via the d3 square, potentially supporting a central pawn push like e4 or reinforcing the queenside after black's aggressive pawn advances. This move develops the queen to a more active square, supporting the d5 pawn and creating potential pressure along the b-file against white's queenside. This knight maneuver, NBD2, aims to reinforce the central pawn complex while preparing to potentially redeploy the knight to a more active square like f3 or even e4 if the opportunity arises, addressing the imbalances created by black's pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to its most natural square, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing to castle, while also reinforcing control over the key d5 square. This move opens up the center dramatically, creating dynamic possibilities for both sides by challenging black's central pawn and freeing the bishop on c1. This capture is a critical decision that fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating an isolated pawn for black on d5 and opening the g-file for white's rook. This move recaptures the pawn, opens the e-file for potential piece activity, and importantly, challenges black's central pawn presence, which has been weakened by the pawn sacrifice. This move completes the development of the king's side, bringing the king to safety and preparing to connect the rooks for future action along the central files. This move activates the rook on f1, preparing to challenge the open e-file and support potential central pawn advances or attacks against black's kingside. This move actively occupies the central d-file, challenging white's bishop on e4 and preparing to support further pawn advances or piece activity. In the center, the queen repositions to e3, offering excellent support for the e4 pawn and preparing to potentially join an attack on the kingside or defend along the third rank. This move aims to improve the king's safety and activity, potentially preparing for a kingside pawn push or facilitating the defense of the d5 pawn in the future. This move aims to solidify white's queenside pawn structure and restrict black's b-pawn while potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or controlling the b5 square. This exchange resolves tension on the d5 square and simplifies the position, allowing black to solidify their pawn structure and prepare for central pawn advances. This queen recapture re-establishes central control and prepares to contest the open d-file while keeping the pawn structure intact. The knight repositions to f8, intending to eye the weak dark squares on the kingside and potentially transfer to g6. Solidifying the king's defense and supporting a later kingside pawn advance. This move begins to undermine black's queenside pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses to exploit on the queenside. This move initiates a queenside pawn lever to challenge white's spatial advantage, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and potentially create counterplay. This pawn thrust on the kingside aims to create space and potentially initiate a pawn storm, disrupting black's kingside structure and opening lines for white's pieces. This pawn exchange on the queenside initiates a dynamic struggle for central control and opens the a-file for potential future pressure. This capture opens the a-file for white's rook and allows for more active piece play, while black must now address the newly created structural weaknesses on the queenside. This move activates the rook on a dynamic central file, aiming to pressure white's queenside pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities along the fourth rank. This move initiates a direct kingside attack, exploiting the open g-file and the weakened dark squares around black's king after the pawn exchange. This move strategically repositions the king away from the dangerous open diagonal and prepares for potential defensive maneuvers while the rook on a4 is somewhat vulnerable. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and prepare for potential mating attacks. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak squares around white's king and potentially preparing to support a central pawn advance or challenge the rook on the a-file. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, indirectly pressuring the g7 pawn and preparing to coordinate with the rook for potential attacks. On the kingside, black recaptures the pawn, accepting a doubled pawn on the f-file but gaining central space and opening the diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. This pawn push, 24, h5, is a critical defensive maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's attacking coordination on the queenside and potentially create counterplay by opening the h-file for white's rook. This move aims to relocate the bishop to a safer square and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside, but it weakens the dark squares around the king and allows white to maintain significant pressure. The queen repositions to c1 to prepare for a potential pawn push on the queenside and to defend the c2 pawn, while also maintaining central influence and anticipating black's counterplay. The knight repositions to e7, aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for potential pawn breaks or rerouting to f5, while also defending the f6 pawn. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses on black's kingside and preparing to support a future advance of the h-pawn. This move is a critical attempt to redeploy the knight to a more active central square, potentially disrupting white's queenside pressure and creating counterplay on the d5 square. This move repositions the rook to an active file, supporting the a-pawn advance and creating potential attacking chances on the queenside. This move aims to challenge white's control of the b-file and force a reassessment of white's queenside initiative, potentially leading to simplification or an exchange of pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support an advance of the e-pawn or initiate an attack on the kingside. Black resolves the tension on the queenside by exchanging rooks, aiming to simplify and activate their pieces while potentially opening lines for counterplay against white's king. The recapture of the rook on b1 is crucial for white to maintain material equality and challenge black's increased activity on the queenside by opening the b-file for potential counterplay. Black initiates a bold pawn advance to challenge white's queenside structure and create counterplay. This knight maneuver prepares to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially exploit the vulnerable pawn on f6 while also offering flexibility to redeploy towards the center. This move repositions the queen to a more active square on the queenside, aiming to exploit the open a-file and potentially create threats against white's kingside pawn structure or king. White is consolidating their position after black's queenside play, aiming to reinforce the rook on the e-file and potentially prepare a central pawn break or further kingside pressure. The knight repositions to c3, a strong central outpost, aiming to pressure white's queenside and potentially support a further queenside pawn advance. This pawn sacrifice opens the d-file for your rooks and aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn majority by creating a passed pawn, though it weakens your own king's protection. This recapture strategically centralizes the knight, aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed king and pressure the d-pawn, while also opening lines for black's pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it can potentially support the d5 pawn or transfer to other parts of the board, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king. This move re-centers the queen to a more active square, preparing to potentially defend the weak pawns on the queenside or join an attack on the kingside. This move re-centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a pawn advance or trade on the king's side. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the potential advance of the d-pawn and preparing to defend the kingside should black attempt any tactical incursions. This move directly attacks the vulnerable pawn on g6 and simultaneously prepares to bring the queen back into the attack along the g-file or h-file, aiming to exploit black's currently exposed king. This move defends against the immediate threat of qh6 attacking the bishop on e7. while also preparing to develop the knight to f5 to contest the dark squares. This move reroutes the queen to a more active square, supporting potential advances on the kingside while preparing to contest the d-file or support a central pawn push. The rook's repositioning to the d6 square prepares to contest the open d-file, a crucial central highway, and offers potential support for the advancement of the pawn on c5 or a defensive role against white's incoming pieces. White repositions the rook to the c-file to contest control and prepare for potential advances or sacrifices, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure and king safety. The knight's move to c3 establishes a strong outpost, attacking the bishop on b2 and preparing to infiltrate white's position, potentially aiming for d5 or e4. This move, qf4, aims to simplify the position by forcing exchanges, as black's queen is currently the most active piece and white wants to reduce its influence. This move is a brilliant deflection tactic, sacrificing the rook to draw the queen away from defending the critical f2 square, creating mating threats.